Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Law and Crime Network. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us here on the program where we cover the most interesting live trials and legal stories in the news today. Got a lot to cover. Let's get started. What an emotional day in court that was for Jason Carter and his family right there. I want to get some perspective as we break down this trial. Joining me is trial attorney Kelly Hyman. Kelly, good morning to you on this Monday morning. Good to see you.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on the show. It's good to see you as well.
So let's break this down. Were you surprised when you saw this verdict? I mean, the prosecution put a pretty strong case together, saying that he had the opportunity, he had the motive, he made weird statements. We're going to break it all down, but the defense also had some good points. Were you surprised by this verdict?
I wasn't surprised by the verdict because it seemed to me, looking over the trial, there was a lot of speculation, circumstantial evidence. They never found the gun. There was no ballistics on him to prove that he actually shot his mom. I mean, it's interesting because the civil case, there was a verdict, $10 million against him. So you think because of that, the jury would come back guilty in the criminal case. But that wasn't the case. Yeah,
I know. And that was a weird part. Usually what happens is you get some sort of verdict in the criminal trial, and then it goes into the civil arena. Here we had the opposite, and you had a civil jury who ruled one way and a criminal jury that ruled another way. And that's interesting. That talks about our legal system right there. Beyond a reasonable doubt, preponderance of the evidence, two different standards. Let's just focus now on the criminal trial, and let's go back to some testimony at the beginning. And we saw Curtis Seaton, who's not only the defendant's friend, but he was a former first responder, talking about what this scene looked like. Take a look.
When you arrived on scene, who was present?
I arrived on scene and drove up the driveway. Bill and Jason Carter were present outside the residence.
So were you the first emergency responder to arrive on scene?
Yes, I was.
What did you observe when you first arrived? And what about Jason's demeanor?
I would describe his demeanor as acting hysterically. He was upset, but acting more in a hysterical manner, saying a lot of things.
You know, Kelly, his demeanor, Jason Carter's demeanor, became a big issue in this case. Was he too emotional? Was he faking it? Why was he making weird statements? Based upon what you've seen in this case, do you think there was anything odd about how he was behaving after discovering his mother?
No, I don't think so. You know, people grieve differently, and so people react differently based on the circumstances. You know, there's an old saying that some people, when people go to a funeral, that they laugh, and that's just a way of dealing with it rather than crying. And so that doesn't really mean anything because it's the way he coped with it.
Well, what about the fact that Jason Carter noticed these bullet holes? You know, he sees his mother dead on the floor, mentions a comment that the house appears to be burglarized, and then sees these bullet holes. Again, the prosecution wanted to say he's only observing things and saying things that the killer would know. Thoughts?
Yeah, you know, that's a good point, that they're saying that, you know, he knew about the gun before, you know, anyone else. He knew the fact about the bullet holes, shows that he was actually there and allegedly committed the crime. Right. You know, that's circumstantial evidence that helps prove the prosecution case that he did commit the crime.
And we learned a little bit more about these statements from Curtis Seaton. Let's play some more of his testimony from the beginning of the case.
Now, while you were in the home, did you make any other observations?
I observed what looked like a chunk out of the floor. Would have been to the left of the victim as she lied on the floor. Also a hole in the refrigerator behind the victim, orientated. Direction would be from the northeast of the victim. I then was curious about the comments that Jason made about the house being ransacked. Given the description that it might have been ransacked as part of a burglary, in my opinion, it appeared too neat.
Objection.
I love this part, Kelly. The idea that was this a staged burglary? Because if you take the prosecution's theory, Jason Carter shot his mother, made it look like it was a burglary gone wrong. But I like this perspective too. Is it not plausible that somebody really broke into the house. They were beginning the stages of burglary when they're caught by Shirley Carter and they ultimately kill her. So how did you weigh these two different theories?
You have to think about them, both. You make a really good point, Jesse. You have to think about the fact that, yeah, was it actually someone was going in there and they were trying to rob her and then she actually caught him and then they shot? Or was this something that was orchestrated? And ultimately, it was what the jury determined, and they, determined that he was, found not guilty.
But
so based on that, they felt like, that wasn't, he didn't do that. He didn't go in there. He didn't, mess up the place to make it look like a bogus, accident.
But isn't it more like, isn't it seem more plausible that her son would have done it? I mean, the idea here that complete strangers would come into a house and kill this old woman, this elderly woman, as opposed to Jason Carter, who had the opportunity. They claim he had the motive. Were you surprised that there wasn't a mistrial or that a juror was, holding out or something like that? I mean, this is another way of looking at it because the prosecution did make some good points.
No, absolutely. The prosecution did make some, very good points about, how that he set up this email address, about, the farm, and how he was really, had some issues with money. But, the prosecution said that they didn't have to show motive. But I'm sure the jurors were thinking in the back of their mind, why would someone's own son kill their mother? Why would they do that to her? What was the reason behind it? And I think because they couldn't wrap their hands on it, and because of the other evidence, they said, no one could do this to their own mother.
Yeah, and we'll get into the motive a little bit later, but the thing that I thought was interesting, and I'm curious your perspective, is when the defense said, is it possible that X, Y, and Z could have happened, meaning other people could have done this? And they said, look, we're not going to prove it. We're not going to say, we don't know. We're not going to show it to you, but it's at least plausible. But they only went so far. I thought that was interesting.
No, absolutely. And I thought it was really interesting when they're talking about the safe and the fingerprints. And then there was one fingerprint that they couldn't identify. And you start to think, okay, I wonder whose fingerprint that was. Maybe that was the alleged killer that did it, and they don't have their fingerprint. Maybe through investigation, they'll ultimately find out. And, the defense did a great job of showing that they didn't follow up on Lee, that during the trial itself, they were still investigating Lee. And so, that was a really strong point, a really strong argument for his innocence.
Right. And look, this is why this case captured so much attention, because there's really a lot to break down and a lot to talk about. And we're going to take a quick break. But when we come back, we're going to play for you the testimony of Bill Carter. This is the defendant's father and the victim's husband. We'll be right back. So Jason Carter was found not guilty in the murder of his mother, and we all watched that trial here on the Law and Crime Network. But then the question became, if he was found not guilty, who really killed Shirley Carter? Well, here we had an opportunity on the network to interview the attorneys from both the defense and the prosecution. We're getting some perspective about who they think ultimately killed Shirley Carter. We're going to start off with Allison Canny and Christine Branstad. These are Jason Carter's attorneys. And then you're going to hear from Ed Bull, who is the Marion County prosecutor. Take a look.
Looking through the evidence together, we all have made guesses. There certainly is evidence pointing at a number of different people, but I don't think any of us ever got to the point where any of us was ready to say that we could really name one specific person. I think in the civil trial, if I remember correctly, and I should defer this to Allison, Jason said he hoped it wasn't his father, and I don't think he ever specifically stated that he believed his father was responsible.
It crossed his mind for sure that his dad could have been responsible for it, but he never actually accepted that emotionally, that his father could have done that. And I think as we got all this new evidence in after the civil trial that wasn't available to us in the civil trial, more questions arose about who could actually be responsible for this.
I wouldn't have signed my name to the trial information and brought this case if I did not believe Jason Carter was responsible. With that being said, law enforcement will always continue to investigate as we get leads that are supported by the evidence. And ultimately, that's what this case came down to, was we had, in my opinion, a number of adverse rulings that allowed the defense to get into some things that we didn't believe were appropriate and we thought were persuasive to the jury. We'll have to have an opportunity Once this jury panel is dismissed from their term of service, we will attempt to contact them through surveys to see exactly what they were thinking. Was this a case where they believed the defendant was innocent, or did they just simply believe the state didn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt? And we'll explore those issues. And of course, we are always attempting to, by any prosecutor, I would hope, we want to be certain we have the right guy. And we were certain we did. The jury saw it differently.
Okay, so the prosecution thinks they had the right guy. The defense thinks that it could have been somebody else and it was a faulty investigation. Kelly, what do you make of this? I mean, is Shirley Carter's killer still out there?
I think that's a $64,000 question. I believe police are going to, continue to investigate and make a determination if there is sufficient evidence and if there's someone else, to bring a charge. Unfortunately, we might not ever know the answer to that question. Sadly, we won't know who her killer actually was or what actually happened to her.
And the idea there that, it was suggested that Bill Carter would have been the person that did that. What did you think of that?
It's a hard pill to swallow, no matter how you look at it. In regards to a family member killing another family member, it's something that, is unheard of, that we don't like to think about. And so the father was so emotional, and the fact that he brought the civil suit and won in that, it's a hard pill to swallow to say that he killed his own wife. And why would someone do that? What would be his motive? There appears to be none.
Yeah, it's a horrible set of circumstances. And as Ed Bull said, they're going to probably survey the jury to see if whether or not they think Jason Carter was innocent or the prosecution just didn't meet their burden. I want to play for you, though, when Jason Carter heard this not guilty verdict, his reaction afterwards. Take a look.
I just want to go home and see my kids. It's a little long drive coming. There you go. Thanks to the legal team for doing a tremendous job.
Shelley, I know this was hard for you as well. How are you feeling now hearing this?
Finally, some justice is all that matters.
That's it. Let's go, guys.
We have to go.
So clearly a very emotional Jason Carter and his family as well. I guess, Kelly, my question is, where does he go from here? I mean, what are his options in terms of the civil trial? He lost that $10 million judgment. I mean, he lost that civil trial. He was denied by a judge to get a new trial. Does this case, does him being found not guilty, does that affect the civil ruling in any way? Can he work with that?
If he has exhausted all his appeals in regards to the civil matter, then that's the end of the line in regards to that. It was interesting to see at the end his wife. We forget about what the wife endured. I mean, it came out that Jason had an affair, and the effect of not only on his wife but on his kids. I mean, his wife was interviewed, and she was at a restaurant. She said people would come up to her and say very hurtful and mean things, not only to herself but to her kids as well. And just the emotional up and downs, not only for her but her family, and then also for the father and Jason's sister to lose their mother. This is a sad situation all around for everyone.
And look, we know that his whole family has been torn apart by this. I tried to ask his attorneys whether or not there's going to be any form of reconciliation. I mean, we have about 30 seconds left, Kelly. Do you think that will ever happen?
You hope for something like that, but sometimes there's no turning back. I mean, the fact that the civil suit and against him and the $10 million, I think that unfortunately, as the wife said, the mother was the glue that held the family together. And unfortunately, that glue is gone and the mother's no longer there.
It's just sad. It's just a really sad case from a lot of different angles. Kelly Hyman, thanks so much for coming on today and breaking down this case with me. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Jesse. It's always great to see you.
As it's great seeing you. Okay, everybody, we're going to switch gears. We're going to take a break. When we come back, though, we're going to focus on a different trial. And you know what that is? The John Chuck case. We'll be right back right after this.